The next thing that we want to talk about is the yarn. So much like the different sizes of the needles, the yarn sizes go along with that. And what you have to worry about here is something called the ply, P-L-Y. And the ply means how thick something is. So if you're using chunkier yarn, your needle or hook has to be much larger because you have to be able to move across the piece of work in a larger fashion. Or if you have thread, which is the smallest type of yarn that you can use, and sometimes that's done in lace or in very, very fine crochet. Sometimes it's called fingerling crochet. The ply will be very, very thin. It's almost like you're sewing thread. So I wanted to show you a couple things to read on a yarn label, and I apologize if it's hard to see, but hopefully you'll just get the gist of it. So this is something called worsted yarn. So this is the typical type of yarn that you make blankets with or scarves with, or even sweaters, baby blankets, those kinds of things. What to notice here is that in this very first picture, it says medium, and then there's an actual skein of yarn, and it has the number 4 in it. That means it's 4 ply, P-L-Y, which means that it's basically 4 threads, I guess, twisted together to form one strand of yarn. This is a self-striping yarn, which means that it changes colors all by itself, versus other yarn that does different things. Here is where it tells you the types of tools to use. So if you're using a knitting needle, it's asking you or recommending that you use a 5mm or a US 8 knitting needle. If you are using a crochet hook, it's asking you to use a US H or an 8. And here is the gauge. So it's telling you that for this first one that's using the knitting needle, if you're doing a 4x4 inch piece or a swatch, you should have 17 stitches in a 4x4. So in 4 across, there should be 17 stitches and 23 rows to get a 4x4 in this size correctly. Contrary in crochet, if you're doing a 4x4, you should have 13 stitches across, 13 single crochets, and 14 rows to get a 4x4. More about that when we actually start knitting or crocheting, but I just wanted to point that out. The other thing here is that it'll also tell you if it's washable, whether or not you can put it in the dryer or put it on the iron or any of those kinds of things. It usually tells you what the material is made of, so this is 100% acrylic. It tells you how big this piece is. So for instance, this is a 10.5 ounce or 300 grams, and if I roll it back a little bit, it should tell you the yardage. So this is 603 yards. So when you look at a pattern, it'll tell you, for instance, that in order to complete whatever the width or the height of the finished project is, that you might need, let's say, 1,200 yards. So that means you'll need 2 of these to do that. It could say less, so that means you would just use whatever you need out of this. Another piece of equipment to have is a tape measure. That way you know if your project is finished width is like 36 inches. If you hit 36 inches or not, it will be helpful to know. So hopefully that gives you an insight. Going back to this, depending on the ply, you will see different things. So a 3 is a sport weight, so the yarn is a little bit thinner. Anything less than a 4 or a 3, you get into smaller and smaller needles needed because it's much thinner. Larger than that, you'll get into either it's called bulky or chunky, and sometimes you'll see patterns where it's like, here, buy this really chunky yarn and you'll be able to knit up a blanket in 20 minutes. I don't believe those things, but that's what they tell you on TV. So that's about yarn.